Imagine for a second that you are walking across a heath, just a wild grassy field in the English countryside. You are walking along, minding your own business, and your foot strikes a stone.
You probably would not think twice about it.
Exactly. You would think nature put it there, or it has always been there. It is just a stone. But now imagine your foot strikes something else,
Oh,
a watch.
right.
You pick it up. You see the intricate glass face, the brass gears, the tiny springs coiling and uncoiling. You would never assume that the wind and the rain just happened to assemble that mechanism by accident. You would assume, quite logically, that there was a watchmaker.
And that right there is the classic watchmaker argument. It comes from the 18th century theologian William Paley. It is intuitive, it is powerful, and for nearly 2 centuries, it was the gold standard for arguing that the complexity of life proves the existence of a God.
But what if that watchmaker was actually blind?
That is the central tension we are exploring today. We are looking at Richard Dawkins' landmark book from number 1986, The Blind Watchmaker. But, and this is crucial, we are not just summarizing the book itself.
Right, our mission here is different. We are walking through a detailed critique and analysis of the work. This analysis challenges Dawkins' conclusions using a very specific framework involving logic, ethics, and philosophy.
And before we dive into the deep end, we should drop a quick disclaimer. We are discussing the content of this book and the accompanying critique. We are not presenting original research, and we are certainly not here to tell you what to believe about the universe. Our goal is strictly to impartially unpack the arguments on the table.
Exactly. We are looking at the structure of the ideas. To understand The Blind Watchmaker, you have to understand the context. The analysis notes that this book was published in number 1986.
Which was a very specific cultural moment. Creationism was mounting a renewed challenge to evolutionary theory, particularly in the United States. Dawkins was not just writing a biology textbook, he was writing a defense, an apology in the classical sense, for a purely naturalistic worldview.
So Dawkins takes Paley's argument, the design implies a designer, and he totally flips it. As the author of the analysis explains, Dawkins argues that yes, nature has a watchmaker. Complexity does not just poof into existence, but that watchmaker is not a deity with a blueprint.
It's physics.
Right, physics and natural selection. And it has no foresight, no purpose, and no mind. Hence, the blind watchmaker.
And this brings us to the core mechanic of the book. If you take nothing else away from the science of this discussion, it should be the distinction Dawkins draws between single-step selection and cumulative selection.
Okay, let's unpack this, because this is where the critique gives Dawkins incredibly high marks for clarity. Single-step selection is like, well, it is like that old analogy of a tornado sweeping through a junkyard and accidentally assembling a Boeing number 747.
It is pure luck, and statistically, it is basically impossible.
Right.
And Dawkins agrees with that. He says if evolution relied on single-step selection, pure chance trying to get it all right at once, it would never happen. But, as the author of the critique explains, Dawkins introduces cumulative selection. This is the idea of small, incremental improvements.
You do not build the Boeing number 747 in one go.
Exactly. You start with a piece of metal that is slightly curved. That curve catches the wind a little better than a flat piece. That slight advantage is preserved, and you build from there.
The critique highlights a very specific example Dawkins uses to illustrate this, the evolution of the eye. This is usually the big gotcha for anti-evolution arguments. People say, what good is half an eye?
And Dawkins' answer, which the critique rates as knowledge, meaning it is well supported by evidence, is that number 5% vision is significantly better than 0 vision.
Right, if you are a prehistoric creature trying to detect a predator's shadow.
Yes, a blurry, light-sensitive patch of skin gives you a massive survival advantage over a creature that is totally blind.
So over millions of generations, you go from a light-sensitive spot to a cup shape that detects direction, to a pinhole camera, and eventually to a full lens. It is a ramp, not a cliff.
Precisely. And to prove this was not just storytelling, Dawkins did something really innovative for number 1986. He used early computers.
The biomorphs. I love this part of the analysis.
The biomorphs are fascinating. The critique describes these computer simulations where Dawkins programmed simple rules of variation and selection into a machine. He started with a basic stick figure and let it evolve based on user selection.
And very quickly.
Very quickly, these simple rules generated incredibly complex, lifelike shapes that look like insects or trees.
And the analysis frames this as a major pedagogical innovation. It really helped people visualize how order arises from chaos without a top-down blueprint.
It did. And this leads to the critique's logical assessment of the book's scientific contribution. The analysis argues that Dawkins successfully dismantles the argument from personal incredulity.
That is just the fancy way of saying, I cannot imagine how this happened, so God must have done it.
Right. Dawkins show that just because you cannot imagine the steps does not mean the steps did not happen. The critique rates this section of the book as achieving knowledge and understanding. Dawkins is incredibly skilled at explaining how the mechanism of evolution works.
But, and here's where it gets really interesting, the critique argues that while Dawkins is an A-plus biology teacher, he hits a wall when he moves from biology to philosophy.
This is the major pivot point in the analysis. The critique introduces what it calls the Adlerian epistemic lens. It is based on the philosopher Mortimer Adler's hierarchy. The idea is that opinion leads to knowledge, which leads to understanding, which leads to wisdom.
So, knowledge is having the facts. Understanding is seeing how the facts connect. But what is wisdom in this context?
According to the analysis, wisdom requires the judicious use of understanding toward the highest ends, things like goodness, beauty, justice, and human dignity. The critique argues that Dawkins achieves knowledge and understanding of the biological machine, but he suffers from a wisdom deficit.
A wisdom deficit. That is a heavy phrase. Why exactly does the critique say that?
Because Dawkins conflates biological explanation with metaphysical conclusions. He explains the mechanics of the gene, but he totally ignores the meaning. As the authors explain, the book offers no framework for why things like justice or human dignity should exist or be valued once the illusion of design is stripped away.
So he tears down the old house of meaning, the religious worldview, but he does not really build a new house to live in. He just leaves you in the empty lot of natural selection.
In a way, yes. The critique identifies this as a category error. This is a logical fallacy where you try to use the tools of one field to solve the problems of another. Dawkins takes the empirical facts of science, which deal with the physical world, and tries to use them to answer the question of God's existence.
Which is a philosophical or metaphysical question.
Exactly. The critique notes that Dawkins actually acknowledges this briefly. He admits that a remote first cause is logically possible, like a god who set up a physics and then stepped back.
But he dismisses it.
He dismisses it almost immediately because it does not fit his preferred narrative. The critique argues that the leap from natural selection explains complexity to therefore God does not exist is a huge jump that the science itself simply cannot justify.
And this bleeds into how Dawkins talks to his reader, too. The critique uses the golden rule to assess his rhetoric. And let us just say he does not score well here.
No, he really does not. The analysis points out a concept called ethical asymmetry. Dawkins writes from the position of an elite academic addressing a public he views as basically scientifically illiterate.
There is a specific part mentioned in the text where the critique notes the condescension. Dawkins frames religious belief not just as a different viewpoint, but as a cognitive failure.
Right. And the critique asks a very poignant question.
Yeah.
Would Dawkins accept being dismissed with a label if he could not immediately rebut a complex argument? Probably not. It creates a dynamic where the reader is either with him or they are, frankly, stupid.
Which brings us to the constitutional aims assessment. This was a completely fascinating part of the analysis. The critique actually scores the book based on the preamble to the U.S. Constitution. Like, does this book form a more perfect union? Does it promote the general welfare?
It is a really creative way to measure a book's civic impact. The analysis gives The Blind Watchmaker a preamble score of number 3 out of number 5.
Let us break that down. Where does he score his points?
Well, he scores high on promote the general welfare and secure the blessings of liberty. By advancing science literacy and fighting for intellectual freedom, he is undeniably contributing to the public good. Understanding how our bodies and the world work is essential for medicine, health, and progress.
But the score drops when we look at ensure domestic tranquility and form a more perfect union.
Exactly. The critique argues that the book polarized the culture war between science and religion. Instead of finding common ground, it dug the trenches deeper. By framing the options as science versus faith, he essentially forced people to choose sides rather than showing how the two might actually coexist.
Speaking of options, that leads us to the logical gaps identified in the analysis. The critique accuses Dawkins of presenting false dichotomies.
As the critics note, Dawkins typically presents the reader with a stark choice. You can be an atheist, or you can be a young Earth creationist. He largely ignores the sophisticated middle ground.
Like what, specifically?
Well, positions like theistic evolution, The idea that God uses evolution as a tool, or Aristotelian teleology, which is a philosophical view of purpose and nature. By leaving these out entirely, he makes his victory seem total when he really has not engaged with the strongest arguments on the other side.
There is another logical gap the critique points out, and they call it the inverted argument from personal incredulity.
This is the really sharp observation from the authors. Remember how we said Dawkins attacks creationists for saying, I cannot imagine how the eye evolved, so God must have done it?
Right.
Well, the critique argues Dawkins sometimes does the mirror image of that. He says, I can imagine a plausible Darwinian pathway for this to happen, therefore it did happen that way.
Oh, I see. Just because you can simulate it on a computer or describe a theoretical path does not mean there's actual historical fact. Imagined pathways are not demonstrated facts.
Precisely. It is a subtle shift from this is possible to this is certain, and the critique flags it as a significant logical overreach.
Now, we have to talk about the origin of the origin. This was the part of the analysis that really made me stop and think. The text quotes the philosopher Dallas Willard on this.
Yes, the problem of cosmic Darwinism. Here is the core issue. Natural selection is a mechanism that works on things that can replicate. You need a gene or a cell that can copy itself. Once you have that, natural selection can refine it.
But where did the first self-replicating thing come from?
That is the trillion-dollar question. Natural selection cannot explain its own origin. You need chemistry, physics, and a self-replicating structure before selection can even start working.
It is like having a factory that builds better factories, but you still need someone to build the first factory.
Exactly. The critique argues that Dawkins struggles to explain these preconditions. He assumes the machine is already running, but does not fully account for who or what built the factory in the first place.
And even when he talks about the genes themselves, the critique notes he gets a little metaphorical.
Yes, the anthropomorphization of the gene. Dawkins famously writes about genes as if they have desires, they want to replicate, they are selfish. Even sympathetic critics note that this is a metaphor disguised as a mechanism.
Because genes do not actually try to do anything.
Right, they are just chemicals. By giving them agency, he smuggles a kind of purpose back into the picture through the back door.
So, pulling this all together, we have a book that is an absolute masterpiece of scientific explanation. The critique calls it arguably the clearest exposition of cumulative selection ever written.
Absolutely. If you want to understand the mechanics of evolution, this is a vital text.
But according to the analysis, it is philosophically flawed. It offers knowledge without wisdom. It explains the machine but completely ignores the meaning.
And that brings us to the so what for you listening. Why does a critique of a book from number 1986 matter today? It matters because it highlights the critical importance of distinguishing between scientific facts and the philosophical stories we tell about those facts.
We hear follow the science all the time, but the science does not always tell us what the facts mean for our actual lives.
Correct. Science can tell you how an eye is built. It cannot tell you what you should look at or why beauty moves you to tears. Those are questions of wisdom.
The analysis leaves us with a final, provocative thought that I think is worth chewing on. It asks, if natural selection is blind, by what standard do we call the products of evolution, like human consciousness, altruism, and moral reasoning good?
That is the ultimate unresolved question. If the universe is truly indifferent, where does our sense of good come from? Is it just a survival trick, or is it something more?
But wait, if it is just a survival trick, then even our desire to find the truth, the very impulse that drives science, is just another trick to keep us alive, not necessarily a path to objective reality.
And if that is true, then we have to question the foundation of our own rationality. It is a paradox that the naturalistic worldview has to constantly wrestle with.
Something to think about the next time you look at a watch or a flower or the stars. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Blind Watchmaker and the complex arguments that surround it.
It has been a pleasure. Keep asking questions.
See you next time.